I have a couple of confessions to make. The first one is, even though I am the director of CASBS and work very hard in Palo Alto, I actually live in Seattle, which is a wonderful city, and you could hear that from what Carrie was saying. The other thing I should confess is that Ira and I both started as urbanists. We started our careers studying cities, and we're in a group together more than 40 years ago. When I was a graduate student, you were a young assistant professor at Columbia that met between Cambridge. We met regularly between Cambridge and New York. So these issues have been in our mind, and we've been watching cities for as long as I can remember, working in cities, caring about cities, trying to do something about cities, studying cities for a very long time. This was a really exciting event for me. It was a real festival of ideas, and it was one that really raises questions. It was one that really raises questions about what we as social scientists and those who are in the media world and who are involved in a variety of ways with cities can actually do to use the social science that we have in order to improve the world we live in, and in this case, particularly the cities that we live in or observe or care about or should care about. And hopefully the discussion today will lead us to somewhat more informed thinking, more informed choices, but also to even further improvements in our social science. I think it raises questions that we still need to answer, as well as clarifying where we've made some progress. And I know we both have a few things to say about that. We started with Tony Hsieh, and his description really fascinated me because when he talked about maximizing serendipitous interactions and collisions, connectedness, co-learning, purposeful visitors, it sounded like the description of what we're trying to do at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. The difference, Pepper, is that there are old people there as well as young people there. We have all kinds of ages represented at the center. And my husband asked the question as Tony was finishing. He said, where is government for good or ill in that? And we have government at CASBS. I'm government at CASBS. So today we've heard about some very big questions in which I think I was delighted with how much progress as social scientists we've actually made in the 40-some years since Ira and I started talking about these questions, at least together. You know, these are things we know at some level, but know more about as a result of some of the research that you heard today. We know we have to correct income inequality, and we heard a lot more about income inequality and what it affects and what affects it. Our education deficit remains a major issue for us to face, but listening to Pedro, I felt inspired that we were making progress in at least understanding the sources of that deficit and some processes by which we might correct it. There were a variety of issues of sustainability that came up, not only of the environment, but also and of the infrastructure, and those are very important questions, and that was a fabulous panel, Eric and Marion, and I know Stuart's already left. But it's also sustainability about what is most appealing about cities, and this is part of what Saskia was trying to get at, and whether density is really cityness. It's entrepreneurship and innovation, and again, there was a wonderful panel with Mario and Margaret, the other Margaret, and Allison talking about that. And the emphasis was not only, and this was what was really interesting, was not only about entrepreneurship as it affects the tech industry, creating another Silicon Valley someplace, that was a question, but it was equally important about the incredible creativity and entrepreneurship that happens in what we think of as ghetto neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, that create a vital city that we wouldn't have without that kind of entrepreneurship, and why there's huge variation in that, the heterogeneity that you were talking about, the conditions that create that kind of possibility. The arts didn't get much mention there. We did have some wonderful conversation about architecture and the way in which architecture and the Seattle Sculpture Park, for example, has enlivened the city with a wonderful park that is also a park devoted to arts. But there wasn't a lot of conversation, but this is another thing that makes cities special, is that and it's in your book, Ed, of course, is the ways in which they promote art and the capacity to do art. And that also often requires some low-income areas where artists might be able to space to actually do what they need to do and to experiment. But so what's really crucial about cities, of course, is the serendipitous connections and collisions, what Tony was talking about, and I think we've made some progress in understanding where they go. But there were also some issues that I'd like to see us make, even, not that those aren't issues we need to make more progress on, but there's some that are really right in front of our face that we really have to think about. And this is what I guess Ed called and Saskia referred to as the demons of density. Density is a requirement of many of the things that we're talking about that are good about cities. But we also know that the kind of density we have and the way in which it's been constructed can intensify the terrible effects of Hurricane Sandy or the heat wave in Chicago that Eric has made us very conscious about. So they intensify the effect of floods, and because we haven't really built our cities in a way that keeps the understanding of the kinds of density we have in appropriate perspective. I heard some, but not enough. There was a little allusion to Jane Jacobs, a little allusion to neighborhoods in various panels. But as people were talking, I kept thinking of a model of urban villages. I think of these megacities. Think of Beijing, for example. And Beijing is at least 14 or 15 cities. If you want to see artists, you go to one neighborhood. If you want to go to manufacturing, you go to another neighborhood. If you want to go to universities, you go to 2 other, or 3 other, or 7 other neighborhoods. People live in very different ways within the same city, and they create lives and worlds within those urban villages, some of which work and some of which don't, some of which are diverse and some of which aren't. So it sort of gets back to that heterogeneity within the city as well as across cities. 2 other questions I want to just lay on the table for all of us is one of the issues that came up. It came up very strongly in the sustainability panel, but it's come up in others as well, was the role of philanthropy. And the mix between the private and the public. And this gets back to the fact that I wish Tony had said more about where government came into that. Because a lot of what's happening really generative in cities right now is representing some kind of mix. Some work, some don't. And we need to know a lot more about that combination. Citizenship. It's hard for me not to end with citizenship. It's the thing I care intensely about, have spent a lot of my life studying. And we learned a lot today, I think, about the various forms of voice that can exist. Big data helps with that. That was part of the, both Vesla and Rob made some real contributions to how we think about citizenship in cities. What we just heard from Manuel about forms of mobilization and the ways in which that can play a very important part in cities. But we need to think even harder about what citizenship means in this increasingly globalized world with big data, with different inequality of access, not just of income, to the tools that make citizenship real. I think I'm going to stop there. I know Ira has some other questions. We want to give you some time to have your reactions to what went on today. And we want to come back at the end and conclude with some final ideas about where to go next. And I want to give a lot of thanks to a lot of different people at the end.
So my comments add up to an extended footnote to this rather masterful summary that Margaret gave. And my remarks really will hinge on two pairs. One which was really central to almost everything we heard today. It's the relationship between isolation and connectedness. There's a lot of talk about poverty. Poor people are disconnected from institutions and networks. And that's the second pair, institutions and networks, that I want to remark on. Now, in thinking about isolation and connectedness, let me make a series of simple distinctions. We've talked a lot about the structures of isolation and connectedness, where people live, where they go to school, what the nature of those schools is, et cetera. But I think we need to connect analyses of what might be called the structure of the situation to three other dimensions and think dynamically about how they're linked to each other. And those other dimensions are, first, the dimension of experience. Living in distinctive zones of isolation and connectedness, think of that as a continuum, places us, places groups, places individuals, places people located in different urban spaces, in different experiential worlds. And sometimes structures that look quite similar from place to place may be experienced very differently by different actors, in part as a result of the resources they bring themselves to those structures, in part having to do with history, in part having to do with the way in which the spaces they live in are linked to other spaces and other locations. So we cannot read off experience from structure in any automatic or simple way. And third, or the second distinction I would make from structure of a situation, is one that might be called dispositions. How people are disposed to first interpret their experiences. Nobody except academics really lives structures. People live experiences. And then we map our experiences. We're disposed in different ways to make sense of our experiences. And how we do so itself is not to be deduced from the experiences themselves simply. Experience does not yield dispositions. Dispositions are compounds of ideology, compounds of relationships, compounds of a whole set of vectors of institutional domains and relationships. And last is the domain of action. Action doesn't follow automatically from dispositions. We can have dispositions to behave, but behavior may depend on a whole set of other actors. What are the systems of mobilization available at any given moment of time? How are collective action problems solved or not? What are degrees of trust amongst actors who may then trust each other enough to act on the basis of their shared dispositions? Absent such matters, people may share dispositions but not act. So this is a call, if you like, to take the issue of connectedness and isolation and complexify it, thicken it, create analytical distinctions in order to have sharper and more precise accounts of the dynamic of relations among structure, experience, dispositions, and action. Then a more substantive remark. Structure, experience, dispositions, and action about what in cities? And here I heard 5 different zones today. This is an inductive account. The most common in our conversations today were considerations of the material economic world of wealth, inequality, the distribution of goods, whether they be housing or good schooling, a material dimension of isolation or connectedness. But then we also heard matters that concern physical absence or presence. Someone in prison or out of prison? Is there racial segregation or not racial segregation? And that's, again, not the same as, it's connected deeply to, but not identical to, market distributions of wealth and income. Third, we heard about physical security, not just physical presence, but physical security, in part having to do with crime, but in part having to do, Saskia talked about what it was like in Rome as a young woman to walk out the door and be looked over and feeling uncomfortable. There are different dimensions of physical security and insecurity. And they depend, too, on the extent to which you are connected or not connected from different institutional domains and networks. Fourth is the issue we really didn't talk much about, but I think it's central to the diversity of cities, questions of cultural regard and cultural respect. The more diverse our settings are, the more there are questions about how isolated distinctive cultures are, or subcultures. And when they are distinctive, as they are often, never totally distinctive, how and under what terms can they share a public cultural space? We come back to the question of Palo Alto as suburb or not. What strikes me about this paradise is a certain absence of friction, a certain absence of cultural heterogeneity in the daily experiences. Not in the, this is a very diverse population in terms of who's at Stanford and who lives here, but it's very different than living in Los Angeles, for example, let alone New York. I don't want to be too much of a New York provincial here. And finally, the fifth and last dimension that we really haven't spoken of very much in terms of connectedness and isolation is civic membership, the issue of citizenship that Margaret was just talking about. The ways in which, Veshla talked about this in terms of the ways in which people who've experienced criminal justice systems may feel they're no longer real citizens. And indeed, in some real sense, they're not. If they're ex-felons, they can't vote in many American states. So these dimensions of the material world, the physical presence, physical security, cultural heterogeneity, regard, respect, and civic membership strike me as all areas that need to be probed in terms of isolation and connectedness. And here I want to end with 2 or 3 very quick thoughts. First, I'm reflecting now on a meeting I was at 2 weeks ago that was convened by the Hewlett Foundation, in which everyone under 30 said, "Why are you old people talking about institutions? It's all about networks." And I think this is not a mistake to think about networks, because you can't think about connectedness without networks, but to think about networks absent institutions is a deep error. And the big challenge to us is how to think with an institutional imagination about changing probabilities of connectedness. And that to me was the takeaway of the day, starting with the opening keynote and on through each of the considerations. And finally, what are the standards of policy we should like to impose normatively, as well as analytically and practically, on innovations and what we might want to do in cities? And it seems to me there are different possibilities, and they don't all point the same way. We could say what we would like is a fair and open world in which there's no discrimination and a kind of meritocracy prevails, equal opportunity. Or we could say our policies should be aimed at historical remediation. Myself have written about this from time to time. Or we could say that we want policies that pose a civic threshold, a civic minimum for effective citizenship, and want everybody to be brought about that. The talk about literacy and education earlier today had just that form. Or finally, we could say, we want policies that will prevent cruelty, because so many people in the urban worlds live in cruel circumstances. These are not all the same, and they require choices. Very last thing. What struck me most, you know.
You've said finally 4
I know.
times. At least.
It's a sickness. I'm stopping. There were 3 kinds of imagination, and I loved each one here. There was a visionary imagination. We heard that about Nevada. There's a practical imagination, and to some extent, but it was a subtext, there's also a kind of fearful imagination. Worrying about things being bad to worse, imagining things much better, and thinking practically about how to advance the visionary and prevent the cruel. Thanks.
Well done.